I never thought silence could feel so loud. That night, it did. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, like the house itself is holding its breath. I remember walking around the living room after my mom left for her night shift. She told me she'd be back by sunrise, maybe earlier if things at the hospital slowed down. She kissed my forehead, grabbed her keys, and said the same thing she always told me whenever I slept alone in the house. Keep the doors locked and don't stay up too late. At the time, those words felt routine, normal. I didn't think anything of them. I just nodded, watched her leave, then locked the door behind her like I had 100 times before. I wasn't scared of being alone. Not really. I'd always been the type to shrug off weird noises or shadows that moved when headlights passed by the window. I'd convinced myself that home was the safest place in the world. Nothing could touch me there. That night changed that. It started normally. I made something simple to eat, scrolled through my phone, watched a few videos, the usual stuff. But even then, something already felt a little off. The air seemed heavier, colder, like winter had somehow slipped into the house, even though the heater was running. I kept checking the thermostat because I swore it felt colder every time I walked past the hallway, but the screen always showed the same temperature. When I finally decided to head to my room, it was already past midnight. I remember yawning, picking up my charger, and turning off the living room lights. I expected the darkness, but for some reason, it felt different that night. Thicker. It made me pause for a moment and glance over my shoulder, as if I'd suddenly forgotten how the layout of my own home looked in the dark. I told myself I was being dramatic. Just tired. Nothing more. My room felt a little warmer at least, so I got ready for bed, plugged in my phone, and climbed under the blanket. I left my lamp on because I planned to scroll for a little longer before sleeping. I remember the soft, warm glow of that lamp. At the time, it felt comforting. I didn't know it would be the only comforting thing that night. About 15 minutes passed before I heard the first sound. A soft thud. Not loud, not threatening, just enough to make me look up from my screen. I listened. Nothing. The house was quiet again. I went back to scrolling, but a minute later, I felt something strange, like a vibration through the mattress. It was subtle, but real enough for my body to register. Kind of like someone walking lightly nearby, except the floor didn't creak. I told myself it was the heater turning on, or maybe I had shifted without realizing. But then it happened again. This time I stopped scrolling and sat up a little. My heart didn't start racing yet, but I felt something, an uneasiness I couldn't explain. My room wasn't big. The bed took up most of the space. The rest was just a dresser, a small desk, and a chair. Nothing that could fall or make that kind of sound. I looked around, waiting to hear something else. When nothing happened, I exhaled slowly and rested back against my pillow. But the second my head touched it, the noise came again. A faint, dull thump. Not from the walls, not from the hallway, from under my bed. My chest tightened for a moment, but I forced myself to breathe normally. I'd heard of houses making noise, pipes expanding, furniture settling. I kept saying that in my head like a mantra, trying to calm myself. But then something happened that was impossible to explain away. A soft exhale, drifting out from below me, like someone was under my bed. Breathing. I froze. Not because I believed what I was hearing, but because I didn't want to believe it. My mind pushed back instantly, saying it was the air vent or the heater or the wind outside, except my room didn't have a vent under the bed. and the heater wasn't running, and the wind outside wasn't loud enough to reach beneath a mattress. This breathing was different. Slow, controlled, close. My hand trembled slightly as I lowered my phone, brightness, and turned the screen toward the edge of the bed. I didn't move completely. I was too scared to lean over at that point. I just wanted to see if anything was down there, even if it was just a shadow. But before I could tilt the phone enough to see anything, the breathing stopped. Instantly. Like whoever or whatever was under there realized I was listening. My heart pounded against my ribs, loud enough that it almost drowned out everything else. And then something else happened. Something even worse. My blanket shifted, just a little, almost like a breeze had touched it. Except there was no breeze. I swallowed hard and sat up straighter, gripping my phone like it was a lifeline. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to speak. I didn't even want to breathe too loudly. Because deep down, I knew something was wrong. I've heard my house make sounds my whole life. I know the difference between pipes, wood, and animals scratching outside. This wasn't that. This felt intentional, human, but I forced myself to stay rational. Anything else was too terrifying to accept. I took a slow breath and pulled my legs closer to my chest, away from the edge of the bed. I kept telling myself I would check under the bed after turning on all the lights. That was the plan, simple and safe. But I didn't get the chance, because before I could gather enough courage to move, the breathing came back, slower this time, deeper, right under where I was sitting. My throat went dry, like every drop of moisture disappeared. And as I listened, the breathing changed rhythm, almost as if whoever was under there was trying to match my breathing pattern. I clamped a hand over my mouth, hoping I hadn't made a sound. My mind was racing with explanations that didn't make sense. A burglar? No, the doors were locked. An animal? Not a chance. No animal breathes like that. And then, in the middle of my panic, something brushed the underside of my mattress. It was a gentle upward push, like a hand pressed lightly against the bottom of the bed. I felt every muscle in my body seize. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink properly. I was frozen, listening, waiting, terrified that the next sound would be something worse. And then I heard it. A whisper. Not loud, not clear, but real enough to freeze my blood. It came from under the bed, soft and shaky, like someone struggling to speak through a dry throat. Are you awake? I felt the air leave my lungs in one sharp breath. My phone nearly slipped out of my hand. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The whisper came again, just a little louder. I know. You're awake. That's when instinct finally took over. I threw the blanket aside, jumped off the bed, and scrambled toward the light switch on the wall. In that moment, I didn't care about anything except getting light into the room. But before I reached the switch, something scraped against the floor under the bed. The sound was low and slow, something dragging. I flicked the light on, and the whole room lit up instantly. Silence. A thick, heavy silence filled the room, as if everything under the bed had suddenly turned still, like it was waiting for me to move again. I pressed my back against the wall and stared at the edge of my bed, afraid to step closer. My chest rose and fell quickly as I tried to steady my breathing. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I didn't know what to do next. Checking under the bed felt impossible. Running out of the room meant getting close to it. Calling someone felt like it would take too long. But the worst part? Even in the bright light, I could still hear it, not breathing this time. A soft, slow shuffling sound, as if something was adjusting its position, settling in, and then it went completely still again. That stillness was somehow even worse than the breathing. At least the breathing told me where it was. Now, with absolute silence, I had no idea what it was planning to do. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the door. I wanted to leave the room. I wanted to run into the hallway and out of the house if I had to. But just before my hand touched the doorknob, something unexpected happened. A voice, quiet, shaky, almost childlike, whispered from under the bed, "Don't leave." I froze. The doorknob turned under my hand, but I didn't pull it. I stood there, heart pounding, staring straight ahead at the door, too scared to move. Then the whisper came again, barely audible. "If you leave, I'll follow." My hand slipped from the doorknob. I didn't leave the room. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there in the silence, knowing I wasn't alone. Not even for a second. And the terrifying part? Whatever was under the bed was waiting for me to make the next move. I stood there in the hallway longer than I should have, wondering if what I heard was even real. The house was never this quiet. Usually there were cars outside, a dog barking across the street, or the old fridge humming in the kitchen. But tonight, everything felt muted, like the whole world had paused for a moment just to let me hear that strange breath from under my bed. I tried convincing myself again that it had to be the wind, or the air vent, or something completely normal. But the more I replayed it in my head, the more it bothered me. It didn't sound like a breeze or a mechanical hum. It sounded slow, steady, almost tired. The kind of breath someone makes after walking up a long set of stairs. I tried distracting myself. I walked to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of cold water, and stood by the sink without turning on the lights. The moon through the window was enough to see the edges of everything. And honestly, I didn't feel like switching on the bright overhead light. Something about it felt wrong, like light might somehow attract whatever was making that sound. I kept telling myself I was being dramatic, but even I didn't believe my own excuses anymore. After a few minutes, I went back to the living room and sat on the couch, letting the TV play some random show I wasn't even watching. The noise made the house feel less empty. I texted my friend, but she didn't reply. It was late, and I didn't want to seem scared or childish by saying something like, "Hey, I think something might be under my bed." Who even says that at my age? But the thought kept circling. If something was under there, how long had it been there? Was it there earlier? Did it get inside tonight? Or was it hiding the whole time without me knowing? The more I tried to push the idea away, the more my mind drifted back to small things I had ignored, like earlier that day, when I came home and found my bedroom door slightly open. I always close it before leaving. Not because I'm picky, but because my window catches the wind sometimes and slams doors around. If my door isn't closed, it knocks against the wall. But when I saw it open today, I just brushed it off. And then there were my shoes. One of them had been moved a little, just a few inches from where I normally keep them. But again, I didn't think much about it. Now, all of those tiny details felt like pieces of a puzzle I should have paid attention to. I tried to take a deep breath, but my chest felt tight. I wasn't sure if it was from fear or from overthinking. The TV wasn't helping. Every sound from the show blended with the noise in my house, and I couldn't tell what was real anymore, so I muted it. At first, muting the sound felt comforting, until I realized how loud silence can be. It was so quiet, I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, and beneath that, a soft creaking from upstairs. I froze. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I waited to see if it happened again. Sometimes the house made noises from the wood settling at night, but after a few seconds, I heard it again, just a small, light shift, like someone putting weight on the floor one careful inch at a time. Not enough to be obvious, but just enough to be noticed. My throat felt dry, and my fingers tightened around the blanket on the couch. I didn't want to look at the stairs, but my eyes went there on their own. The shadows around the railing looked darker than usual, like the corners were somehow thicker. My mind kept whispering that maybe it was nothing. Maybe the sound came from outside. Maybe the wind pushed a branch against the roof. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was inside the house with me. I thought about calling someone, my mom, my uncle, anyone, but I didn't want them to worry. And what exactly would I say? That I heard something breathe under my bed once? That I heard a creak that might just be the house? I didn't want to sound paranoid, so instead I sat there, trying to listen carefully while pretending everything was normal. Minutes passed, though each one felt strangely long. The house stayed still. No more creaks, no more strange breaths. The longer nothing happened, the more I started doubting myself again. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just tired and letting my mind make things up. Eventually, I stood up from the couch and slowly walked toward the stairs. I didn't know why. Curiosity, maybe. Or the need to prove to myself that everything was fine. But as I stepped on the first stair, I felt a slight tremble in my legs. I kept going, holding the railing lightly so I wouldn't make noise. By the time I reached the second floor, my heartbeat was loud enough that I was scared it might drown out other sounds. My room was at the end of the hallway, and the door was still closed, exactly how I left it earlier after running out. Everything in the hallway looked normal, quiet, familiar. But as I walked toward my room, something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt different, colder somehow. Not freezing, but cool enough that I noticed it. I stood in front of my bedroom door for a long moment, wondering if I should open it or go back downstairs and pretend everything was fine until morning. I didn't want to, but a part of me knew I had to check. I placed my hand on the doorknob. It felt cool, like no one had touched it in hours. That made me feel a little better. I turned it slowly and pushed the door open just a few inches. The room was dark except for the pale moonlight slipping through the curtains. My bed looked normal. My desk was still messy in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place. But I didn't step inside. Not yet. I reached for the light switch on the wall and flipped it on. The soft yellow glow filled the room. Everything looked exactly the same as it always did. A small wave of relief washed over me. But then, my eyes drifted to the floor. My blanket was hanging slightly lower on one side, much lower than it was earlier. I stared at it, trying to figure out if it had always been like that. Maybe I pulled it by accident when I ran earlier. Maybe it slid on its own. But before I could settle on an answer, I saw something else. My pillow, normally positioned neatly in the center of the bed, was tilted just a little. Not enough to notice at first glance, but enough that I knew I didn't leave it like that. A chill slipped down my back. Something had been on my bed. Or under it. My breath caught in my throat, and I took one slow step into the room. I didn't even know why I walked forward. Fear should have pushed me away. But something about the room felt like it was silently calling me in. I stood by the edge of the bed, staring at the blanket hanging down. The shadow beneath the bed looked completely black, too black, like the darkness under there was thicker than normal shadows. I didn't want to bend down. I didn't want to look. But the longer I stood there, the heavier the silence felt, almost like the air around me was waiting for something to happen. I told myself I'd just kneel down quickly, peek for 1 second, and get it over with. No dramatic pause, no slow movements, just one quick look. I lowered myself carefully, my knees touching the cold floor. My hand lightly brushed the edge of the blanket, and that one small touch sent a small shiver through my body. Everything inside me screamed not to do it. But I leaned forward anyway. And right as I began to lift the blanket, I heard it again, that same soft, slow human breath. Only this time, it was closer, much closer, and it didn't sound like it was coming from under my bed. It sounded like it was coming right next to me. I froze the moment that soft breath touched the air beside me. It felt impossibly close, like someone was leaning in just enough for me to feel the warmth of their presence. My heart was beating way too fast, but I didn't move. I couldn't. Every part of me felt locked in place, waiting for something to happen, some sign I wasn't imagining it. But nothing else followed. No movement, no whisper, just that slow, quiet breath, fading into the stillness of the room. I slowly backed away from the bed, inch by inch, trying not to make a sound. The room around me felt different now, like the shadows were leaning in a little closer than before. I kept my eyes fixed on the edge of the blanket, half expecting something to slide out from underneath, but it stayed still. My voice felt tight, but I managed to whisper out a shaky, "Hello," even though I knew no one would answer. When nothing responded, I stood up and took a few careful steps back toward the doorway. I needed air. I needed space. And most of all, I needed the light from the hallway. Everything inside me felt tangled with fear and confusion, but I didn't want to run. Running felt like admitting something was truly wrong, and I was still hoping, praying, that there was a normal explanation for what I heard. I stepped out into the hallway and leaned against the wall for a moment, trying to think clearly. Maybe the sound wasn't breath. Maybe I misheard. Maybe the fear in my mind had twisted something harmless into something terrifying. People can hear things that aren't really there when they're nervous. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced slowly from one end of the hallway to the other. But the problem was, it didn't feel imagined. It felt real. Too real. I knew I couldn't avoid my room forever. So after a few minutes, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The bright white light cut through the shadows, and somehow that made me feel braver. I went back into my room, taking slow breaths to stay calm. The moment I stepped inside again, I checked the corners, my closet, behind the door. Everything that could possibly hide a person or an animal. But the room was empty, completely. When I finally walked back to my bed, I crouched down again, this time shining the flashlight underneath. The beam showed nothing but a few dust bunnies, an old slipper, and the quiet, empty space. No movement, no shape, no one hiding. It was like the darkness itself had been playing tricks on me. The relief hit me so hard my knees felt weak. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting myself breathe normally for the first time in what felt like hours. But as I sat there, something else caught my attention, something I hadn't noticed before. The window. It wasn't open, but it wasn't locked either. The latch was turned halfway, just enough for someone to open it from the outside if they pushed hard enough. The strange thing was, I knew I locked it earlier. I always do. I walked over to it and pressed the latch down firmly until I heard a soft click. That sound alone should have made me feel better, but it didn't. It only raised more questions. If the window had been touched, who did it? And when? And if someone had really been inside, how did they get out without making a sound? I kept thinking about it, trying to piece everything together. But all I had were small moments of unease and sounds I could barely describe. Nothing clear, nothing definite. Just a growing sense that something had been off in the house long before tonight. Still, I needed to calm down. I grabbed my pillow and blanket and decided I'd sleep downstairs on the couch with all the lights on. It felt safer down there, closer to the door and away from the shadows in my room. I settled into the couch, scrolling through my phone just to keep my mind busy. Eventually, the exhaustion caught up to me, and even with everything that had happened, I felt myself drifting off. I don't know how long I slept, but a soft sound woke me up. A tiny click, like metal lightly tapping against something. I opened my eyes slowly and looked around. The living room was quiet, the lights still glowing softly. I waited for the sound again, unsure if it had been part of a dream. But after a long moment, when nothing else happened, I convinced myself it had been the heater turning on or the fridge settling, normal house noises. Morning came slowly, with sunlight stretching across the floor and making everything look less threatening. I felt tired, but the fear wasn't as sharp in the daylight. I made myself breakfast, walked through the house again, and checked every lock, every window, and every corner. Everything looked normal. There was no sign that anyone had been inside. No strange marks. No footprints. No indication of anything unusual. For a moment, I wondered if the whole thing had been a dream. But then I remembered the sound too clearly, the breathing, the shift of the blanket, the cool air near the bed. Dreams blur at the edges. This didn't. Over the next few days, small things still bothered me. A door slightly open when I knew I closed it. A charger moved from one spot to another. My fan turned off even though I remembered leaving it on. None of it was enough to be sure something strange was happening, but it kept reminding me of that night. Eventually, I decided to talk to my neighbor, an older woman who'd lived on this street for decades. She was someone who noticed everything, the kind of person who always had a theory or a story. When I mentioned the strange noises and asked if she'd ever heard anything odd around the area, she paused for a moment before speaking. She told me she'd heard of people in the neighborhood complaining about strange things, lights turning on by themselves, missing items, windows cracked open in the morning. Most people blamed raccoons or old houses with bad wiring. But she said something that stuck with me. Sometimes, she said quietly, fear isn't proof of danger, but it is proof of intuition. Don't ignore your first instinct. I didn't fully understand what she meant back then, but over time, it began to make sense. Maybe there was never someone under my bed that night. Maybe the breathing was the sound of the house shifting. Maybe the window latch moved because I hadn't closed it properly. Maybe all those little signs were just coincidences lining up in the worst way. But maybe my instincts were warning me about something I couldn't see, something subtle, something that came and went without leaving a mark. I eventually moved my bed to the other side of the room and started sleeping with a nightlight again, even though it felt childish. But after that night, I didn't care about looking childish. I cared about feeling safe. And strangely enough, I did. It's been months now, and nothing else has happened. No strange breathing, no creaking footsteps, no unexplained movements. Everything is calm again. But every time I drop something under my bed and have to reach down to grab it, I pause for a moment. Not out of fear anymore, but out of memory. A quiet reminder that sometimes the scariest moments in life aren't the ones with clear answers. They're the ones that leave us with questions we carry long after the fear fades. And even though I still don't know what I heard that night, I do know one thing. I trust my instincts now. Because whether it was something real or just my mind trying to protect me, that feeling saved me from ignoring something important. Some nights, when the house settles and I hear a soft shift in the quiet, I still stop and listen, just for a second, just to be sure. And then I move on, knowing that not every mystery needs a perfect explanation. Sometimes the unknown itself is the reminder we need to stay aware, stay grounded, and stay connected to that small voice inside that tells us when something doesn't feel right. That night changed me, not because something bad happened, but because it made me pay attention. And sometimes, paying attention is the real story.